The Future of a King. Chapter 5. Without Arthur. I never had a father. Sometimes I think about the things that would be different if he were here. I had uncles who would do fatherly things, though 3 of them to be precise. If father were here, he would not only be my father, but also King of Camelot. There are 4 people who have taken up the mantle of leadership in his absence. Uncle Leon is the one who taught me almost everything I know about fighting. He started training me at a young age, commenting that he had been there when father learned how to fight too. He is a good teacher, patient and thorough and steady, and, he said with a smile, that he will make me the best fighter in the land, like father was. When he says, "Well done," or that he is proud of me, he says it in the exact same tone he uses for his son, Kay. It's almost like having a father tell me he was proud of me. Uncle Leon is also Mother's right-hand man. He is the first knight, and the man she trusts most to advise her correctly and lead the army. He has always been there for her, his loyalty unquestionable and unshakable. He is Mother's rock, the man she can always depend on. Uncle Percival is the biggest man I have ever seen, but he is also incredibly gentle. He gave the best piggyback rides when I was young. My greatest delight was riding his shoulders around the castle, towering over everyone we saw. He doesn't say much, but I learned over the years that when he speaks, he is well worth listening to. And he is the only person whose advice I will follow without protest. I convinced him to spar with me once. I came away from that experience pitying any man who tried taking on Percival in a fight. Mother relies on Percival's advice too. He is second to Uncle Leon in the army, and when Leon is busy, he will take over training me, typically alongside with Kay and Galahad. The 3 of us are around the same age and skill level, and we often train together. It is both Mother and Uncle Merlin were busy. Uncle Percival was the man I usually sought out when I was young, for he always had time for me and listened to me with the same attention he would give anyone else. Mother is the one on whom most of the ruling has fallen on, of course, and she has shouldered it with grace, dignity, and a leadership almost everyone will willingly follow. She has always been one of the people, listening to them and trying to be the best queen she can be for them. There are a few stuffy lords who will still say that because she was a servant, she shouldn't be queen, but their viewpoint is very unpopular. Somehow, Mother has managed to win over the people and lead them well, while also being there for me every time I have needed her. She has brought me along with her almost everywhere she goes, being a mother and training me at the same time. But she also spends a lot of time alone with me, and is an excellent listener and playmate. Breakfasts have always been our time. Only Uncle Merlin can intrude every once in a while. Uncle Merlin is court sorcerer, of course, and the one who advises Mother on everything magical, although I think she listens to him on his advice more than that as well. He helps her run the druids, who usually only listen to him, and he is a brother to Mother. I thought they were actual siblings by blood until I was around 6. Uncle Merlin has also been there for me throughout the years, teaching me about magic and so much more. There for me alongside Mother every step of the way. Still, there have been days when, despite the fact I have 3 wonderful uncles, I feel alone and fatherless, and Uncle Merlin is the only one I have dared talk to about this. There was one day when I stormed into his quarters, having stewed on the matter until I was furious. Why did Father leave? I demanded, without stopping for a hello. Merlin looked up from the parchment he was writing on, looking confused. That wasn't really his choice, he said after a minute. I slammed the door and threw myself into a chair. He shouldn't have left, I nearly shouted. Everyone else has fathers to take care of them and play with them. Why don't I? Why did he leave me? Uncle Merlin watched me thoughtfully until I had finished with my rant. Then he leaned back and studied the ceiling. Did I ever tell you, he said quietly, that I never knew my father growing up? No, I said, interested in spite of myself. He had never told me much about anything about his father. I wondered what you wonder at times, Merlin told me quietly. Why would he have left my mother and me, if he cared for me at all? My mother never told me anything about him. I didn't learn until I was older than you who he was, even. I was absorbed in the story. Uncle Merlin shifted forward, though he didn't meet my eyes. Eventually, I learned he was a dragon lord. You know the story. Camelot needed him, so Arthur and I went to find him. I'd never been told who he was, because he was a hunted fugitive, and he hadn't even known he had a son. What happened after that? I asked softly. Uncle Merlin never really explained that well. I knew him for 2 days, he told me quietly, and he acknowledged me as his son. Then he died, defending me. There was a silence for a moment. Merlin was running his fingers along the small carving of a dragon he always kept on his desk. He finally looked up at me. I know how it feels, he said gently, to be fatherless and to be angry at your father for leaving you alone. But your father had no choice, not even as much as mine did. And he would have loved you if he had lived. No, never doubt that, little dragon. For some reason, I had tears in my eyes by the time he was finished, and I flew across the room to give him a hug. In the absence of King Arthur, it is Uncle Merlin who has been a father to me most. There is a time of year that when I was a small child, I began referring to it as the sad time. I've never bothered giving it more than a technical title. It is the time of year when all 4 of the people in my life become quiet and sorrowful. Mother told me when I was quite young that it is the time of year when my father died. When I was young, I typically spent most of this time with Uncle Percival. He said even less than usual during this time, but since he's rather quiet anyway, he seemed the least affected. It was only when I got older that I recognised the distant, haunted look he gets around this time, and realised that in his own quiet way, he was grieving too. Uncle Leon tends to disappear from the palace around this time. Unless Mother needs him for something, he goes home and spends those days with his family. I began thinking that being around the people he loves most is necessary for him then. Mother still grieves Father during this time. The rest of the year she is strong and always moving forward, often honouring Father in her speeches with a proud gleam in her eyes and no hint of tears. This is the time of year she lets herself wander the places she spent time with him, hold the ring he gave her, and remember him as the man she loved and not as a king. It is the time of the year she lets herself cry. I always felt somewhat strange at this time, because even though my father's been gone and has left a large hole in my life, I never knew him, and I can't grieve the man I lost like those around me can. Grieving the hole in my life he would have filled had he lived feels very selfish when those those around me are grieving wounds torn in their lives by his passing. But Mother seems to derive comfort from having me close, being able to hug and touch me and know that I am here, that I am her legacy from Father and I'm not leaving. Sometimes, during these days, I feel like Mother only sees me as her last bit of Father, but she's always tried to make it clear that I am more than that, but that I am all the family she has left, apart from Uncle Merlin, and she needs me close. Mother and Uncle Merlin tend to spend some of these days close to each other, sharing memories at times, or just being there for each other. But Uncle Merlin has his own way of grieving. He shines Father's old chambers, deserted for years now, until they gleam with cleanliness. He doesn't smile, and has a tendency to disappear more than usual. One year, a fuser flew in during this time. She tends to disappear from Camelot during these days. But this year I saw her flying towards the roof, which was where she often landed, until she got so big Mother was afraid of her shattering the towers if she continued to do that. I was young enough at the time that my thoughts instantly leapt to flying her, so I hurried towards the turrets as fast as my short legs could carry me. Breathless and eager, I emerged to find Uncle Merlin standing by Ephusa, his face so solemn that I stopped short. Ephusa seemed to almost be cringing before him. "You can stop apologising every year, Ephusa," he said softly. "I don't blame you." After a moment in which she clearly replied, he burst out, sounding exasperated. "If I'm to blame you for the mistakes you made, then I have to blame myself 10 times more, and Gwen has been trying to get me to stop doing that for years." He ran a hand down his face. "Look, Ephusa," he said more gently. "I failed you where I should have been there for you, and you were lost and broken. I don't blame you for what you did." She must have said something along the lines that he shouldn't blame himself either, for he sighed tiredly. "There are days when I think that I single-handedly managed to create both of Arthur's worst enemies. If only I had talked to Morgana. If only I hadn't automatically turned on Mordred. Ephusa, I have spent years blaming myself for everything that happened. I'd rather not remember it all now. Just, I've forgiven you. Completely. Alright? I don't blame you." Ephusa nuzzled into him, looking both pitiful and relieved. And I turned away from the tower. Clearly, this was not the time for a flight, but I tried to put the conversation from my mind. I really didn't want to know what Ephusa or Uncle Merlin blamed themselves for. This time of year doesn't particularly affect anyone but the 5 of us, though. The ways my mother and uncle grieve my father are subtle enough that only if you're me do you really see them. They go on running the kingdom as usual, and if they take a little more time to be by themselves than a typical week, I don't think anyone else notices. Though I'm guessing the people of the lower town know that Mother only goes back to the house that used to be hers 1 week in the year. The last time this season of grieving happened, I was old enough to be very curious and adventuresome, so when Uncle Merlin disappeared in the late afternoon, as he had every year, I followed him. He rode through the woods to a lake, arriving there shortly before twilight. I had never been to the lake before, but it was a lovely spot. Lake ringed by mountains and trees, and a dense bed of strawberry bushes, the ripples across the surface shimmering in the dusky light. Uncle Merlin dismounted, tied his horse, and walked to stand on the shore. "You can come out, Amar," he said suddenly, startling me. "I know you're there." Sheepishly, I dismounted and emerged from the trees. "How did you know I was there?" I asked petulantly. Merlin chuckled and sat down by the water's edge. "I could tell I was being followed," he said. that your Camelot red isn't really made for concealment. It wasn't hard to catch a glimpse of you. I felt very foolish, and the way Uncle Merlin was looking at the water, as if I had intruded on something sacred. Do you want me to go? I faltered. He did not bother looking at me. I don't mind if you stay. I could tell by his tone that he actually wanted me there, so I sat down, cross-legged beside him. We sat in silence for a long time as the dusk deepened toward night. Merlin ran his hands through the waves. The longer I sat there, the more I felt that the lake was very peaceful and heartbreakingly sad all at once. I laid Arthur to rest here, Uncle Merlin said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice made me jump, but he didn't seem to notice, and I listened attentively. He had taught me very little of my father's last days. I tried everything I could to reach this place when he was still alive, so the Cide could save him. His words were slow and quiet, and he scarcely seemed to be talking to me at all. I could only send him into the lake and say goodbye, like I buried Freya and Lancelot. But that time, it seemed to me that I buried every dream and hope I'd ever had with Arthur. I wanted to say something, to say that Father's death hadn't been the end and we were still happy. But Merlin was lost in his memories, his eyes dark with pain, and I couldn't say anything that trite to him. I hugged my legs to me, shivering. The lake was nearly dark by the time Uncle Merlin spoke again. This time he turned a bit and directed his words to me. Excalibur rests here too, he said softly. It was meant to be Arthur's sword all along, and no one else should use it now. I put it here after it was first forged. I knew that story, the one of the undead knight and Uncle Merlin making a sword so Father could fight him, until Grandfather took his place instead. It was one of the stories that I could acknowledge Father and Grandfather. I so often nearly hated Grandfather for his blindness, but he acted nobly then. Frey gave it back to me, Merlin whispered, more to the lake than me, and after that I placed it in the stone. I wonder if Arthur will bring it with him when he returns, or if I have to find another way. I don't really want to have us swim out and find it. I knew by now that Uncle Merlin was really lost in his memories, because he had mentioned Freya twice, when he usually didn't speak of her at all. I knew that she was the girl he had loved and lost, and that she was now Lady of the Lake, but that was all. Part of me felt like I had no right to be there, listening to Uncle Merlin's quiet memories, but another part of me felt like it was right for me to be there, remembering Father with the man who had known him the best, honouring him quietly in the dusk of the day by the lake where he had been laid to rest. The comment about swimming had evidently made Uncle Merlin remember something else. He chuckled just a bit and shifted to face me. The first time I ever saw this lake was when Arthur was enchanted by the Cide girl, Sophia, he remarked. I remember that story, I said quietly, where the Cide wanted to sacrifice him by drowning him, and you had to rescue him. As usual, Uncle Merlin remarked slightly. The water is very cold if you decide to swim in it. He turned to look over the lake. I was afraid he would die that day. It was a long time before I found him. In retrospect, though, his announcement to his father that he was going to get married to a girl he had just met was rather funny. I don't think the king believed him at all. I can't picture him with anyone other than Mother, I replied, finding that image disturbing. She was the only girl he ever really loved, Uncle Merlin told me. He hesitated for a moment, and then added, more to himself than to me. That was the first time I realised Morgana was a seer. I still wish... His voice trailed away, and he fell silent. He never talked about Morgana either. But Mother sometimes tells me of the days when she was a good and noble lady and Mother served her. But Merlin can never hear her name without looking away. Your uncle Elian was buried here too, he said, after a long moment. He got an honourable funeral, with everyone there in respect, and he deserved it too. I could only nod, and we sat there in silence, the soft lapping of the waves upon the shore the only sound, as night fell completely, and the stars were reflected blurrily in the lake's surface. Suddenly, the sound of a horse's hooves broke through the stillness. I leapt to my feet, my hand going to the hilt of the sword I wore whenever I left Camelot, but Uncle Merlin did not seem the least perturbed. He stayed where he was until the horse had come to us, even as the rider dismounted and tied the new horse with ours. Only when the stranger came out of the trees did I recognise her as the Queen. "Mother!" I exclaimed, shocked. She gave me a tired hint of a smile and put her arm around me briefly. "I should have known you'd sneak off here," she murmured. Uncle Merlin had stood up now. With a brief glance at Mother, he held out his hands, and his eyes shone gold in the darkness. 3 pieces of wood flew out of the forest and shaped themselves into tiny, rough little boats in his hands. In complete silence, he handed one to Mother and one to me. As Mother and Merlin moved to the lake shore in quiet synchronization, I realized that this was nowhere near the first time they had done this. They must have had this quiet ceremony on the night of the anniversary of Father's death for years. Now I, who had no memory of him to tell, liked diving into the lake to save him, was here at this ritual, and again I felt like an outsider. But Uncle Merlin glanced at me, and with a quick motion of his head, indicated that I should join them. And after all, even if I didn't remember Father, I was his son, and I had the right to honour him too. With sudden decision, I stepped to the lakeside and knelt by Mother, and set my boat in the water like Mother and Uncle Merlin had. Mother suddenly held 2 stubs of candles. She held them out, and in a quick flash of Uncle Merlin's eyes, turned the taller one into 2. Silently, Mother handed a candle to each of us, and Merlin set them aflame. We set the candles on the boats and pushed them off into the lake. I think Uncle Merlin provided them the momentum to leave shore even though the waves were coming up to us, but I wasn't watching him. Through a sudden blur of tears, I was following the little boats with my eyes as they slipped out into the lake. We knelt there by the lake's brink and watched the little vessels of fire floating further and further away, watched as the wood caught flame, watched as they blazed up and then sank beneath the waves. We stayed there on the shore of Avalon all night, Mother, Uncle Merlin and I, Father's wife, closest friend and son, kept vigil over the place where he had been laid to rest. As I rode to the castle the next day, sore and stiff but oddly at peace, I felt as though I had grieved my father properly for the first time in my life.